All right, so just a little bit here. Another episode, Two Kings Challenge, and Frank McFarland here with Brian King. We gave you a lot of the numbers that we looked at last week. I'm going to try to go through some of those today, and maybe a little bit quicker. And I know in a lot of ways, when I saw the numbers for this week, my instant thought was, like head drop. This is the worst week for us to be talking about this for Charlotte, probably of the past month. But I'm ready to do it, and so let's see where we get into there. But Brian, tell me a little bit about where you're at with things at this point now too.
Well, I understand that the two best views of Mount Everest is from the top and from the very bottom. So when you're looking at numbers, we need to know where we're going to go. It's interesting to dig back into it. And what I love about digging into the numbers is it strips away all of the thoughts, all of the excuses, all of the this is where it is. Now, I will say this, that it is impossible to do snapshots and feel confident that you have answers about your firm. Okay, so one of the things that I'd say is, yes, it does those things. It strips away excuses. It strips away a lot of other things, but it also can give you false impressions in terms of what you're looking at in terms of your case, so or your firm. So I don't want to get too caught up, because what numbers do, and I think that we've talked about this before a little bit, but what numbers do is they make you ask the right questions. I don't think that they necessarily answer those questions, but what they do is they make you ask the right questions instead of the questions that you think that are out there. My mentor in this area, Stephen Fairley, who just died very suddenly during the pandemic, and he always told me that, Brian, and told everybody, you have three firms. You have the firm that you think you have. You have the firm that your employees tell you have. And then you have the actual firm that you do have. So that in line, let's dive into these numbers and see, instead of what we think that we have, or even what our team tells us we have, tell us what we actually have. Let's go through some numbers.
Yeah, and let me just piggyback on one thing you said there first before we dive into these, because I do think there is a big difference. I think the numbers tell us where we are, and you're exactly right about the excuses. But I think we do need to figure out some explanation for this, because I think that's ultimately where our solutions are too. So you might hear some things that sound a whole lot like excuses from me today too, but the truth is none of that matters. It's how do we get past it. So
right. There's a big difference between an excuse and deductive reasoning. I mean, that once you get these numbers, you have to deduce from those numbers as to what the problems are. And you're right. Sometimes that's going to feel like excuse, but there's a big difference. I constantly tell my kids, there's excuse and then there's cause. Is that an excuse or is that a cause? And I think that's what the kind of exploring that we do. By the way, it's terrible to be the kid of a lawyer, especially a managing partner of a firm, because everything's a case and everything's a law firm.
So yeah, and that's hard to argue. I think overall in terms of where this thing goes and where what I know that my kids will deal with also. So
we're in different stages, but it's the same problems.
I feel like my oldest is at least going on like 14 or 15 most of the time. She's giving me advice all the time and stuff. I don't know. She's 4, by the way.
Yeah, I've got a 15-year-old daughter, and she, somewhere along the way, she passed me. I don't know how that exactly happened, but it goes from giving you advice to now she's just disappointed in me all the time. So.
Yeah. Strangely, that happened with my daughter from somewhere between like 3 and 4. So now she's lapped me. But I want to start, we talked about this one number. We talked about billed and collected. I want to preface this with an excuse on this. When it comes to billed numbers and collected numbers, there's a very human element to this, which is we don't really know what happened in a week at any particular point unless it's tracked. So when time is tracked for us, we know exactly what was billed. We know exactly what we collected off of those cases. There are times where real life stuff happens, and we may have, there may be a week that passes before some time gets put in from, a week-long trial or whatever it might be. So I preface this with that to start with. But our goal here for collected is somewhere in the 19,000 neighborhood per week. That's not realistic right now with where we are, probably in any office. And it's also not realistic for us at this point to point blank say, this is what was collected in Charlotte versus what was collected by the attorneys that work in Charlotte or the attorneys that work in Asheville. And I don't know where you fall on this line, but for Asheville, when I ran these numbers, I went a little bit differently there. So I included 2 attorneys. We may have some adjustment on that. I think the truth is there's some overlap and some other parts that we can adjust later on. But roughly for Asheville, we were looking at about 15,000, 16,000 collected. I would venture to say that the number's a little bit less than that overall, but that's what the raw numbers, if we just look at attorneys, case manager, that's roughly what it looks like. Now, again, there are other people that circle into Asheville, so that number is not perfect. But on the Charlotte end, we were at about 5,000 last week, which was a huge dip from where we were the week before. But like I said, I don't want to say too much about that, but there is a human element to this. And I think that once we get to that point, the numbers may better reflect what last week looks like. I think on average, we've probably been more in the 10 range, but there is one huge difference there. And at least right now, that's going to change even more. You're going to get a $3,000-$4,000 cushion from your case manager that we're not going to get in Charlotte right now. So there are factors to go into that. Maybe we can evaluate that a little bit in terms of maybe a percentage or something that we need to work through on the case manager front too. But that's the big one, the number to start, and it's obviously a disappointing week for Charlotte.
Well, of course, that's an encouraging number for Asheville, but I also agree. What we've done is we've moved 2 pieces on our chessboard to Asheville. And with Jeannie, you're talking our case manager. That move is truly like moving your queen in chess. I mean, that's taken a lot of money and billing, probably from other areas, and moving it right into the Asheville market. And maybe we should point out it was a pretty good week for us overall in the firm. And it is very difficult to regionalize and all of our numbers are going to be reflective of that. Then you throw in the issue of Victoria Corey, who is a fantastic attorney, but still young and learning. She's definitely going to be a building block of that Asheville office over time. She self-admittedly said, like, look, I'm going to go in and I'm going to talk and I'm going to deal with every one of our clients this week. And she's done that. Her landing day is, as we talk right now, 1 week from today, where she's going to be full-time in Asheville. She, I think, has exceeded her expectations in terms of March. But you get a little bit of a bump when you go in and you're like, okay, I'm going to work on every one of my cases. I'm not going to work to the extent of, I'm going to not work on my building up of other cases, and I'm not going to work on some of my non-billable stuff. I'm going to dig in. Attorneys have the ability to be able to do that. That's going to be reflective of good weeks and bad weeks, as much as, hey, business was good or something like that. That if we just had, let's say, a store front, and you could say like, well, it's a good week or bad week based on how many customers, those things. It's more like being a general contractor or something like that, where you're like, look, some weeks we're going to be building and building, other weeks we're going to be procuring, equipment. So those aren't going to be as good of weeks, and that's exactly the kind of format that we have. So I would definitely say that Asheville had a hit the numbers, and you can see even now, even with that, it wasn't enough. And I might want to add in that a little bit of my work was Greg Newman, one of our attorneys in Hendersonville, came swinging into Asheville, and you're talking about an attorney with over 30 years of experience. He's not going to, a prospective client is not going to walk out of the office after a meeting with him and think, well, maybe I should, maybe I shouldn't. They're going to know. He's going to tell them what they need to do, and he's going to bring money to the table when he does. So that's another luxury that right now I have in Asheville that you don't have really in Charlotte. So overall, I wouldn't say that 15-5 is significantly far off from what we would say we would have guessed what these numbers would have looked like going into the week. And what you really have to do in all things is you determine your expectation, because this is, I think, one of the problems with small business owners. And if you're listening to this podcast and you run a business but not in law, this is why you cannot judge how well your business is going just by that revenue number you just said. You cannot. There's arrow up and there's expectations and where you are. So I would just say that both of us shot par. Maybe I got a birdie out of in that number, but I don't think that it would be a significant difference between the two of us as far as that money goes. Even if there is a fairly, in 6 months, if these numbers were the same, we'd have completely different thoughts about what that looked like.
Yeah, I agree completely. I agree completely on that topic. But and I know, and you talk about Victoria and the 4-1 date. Really, even with Tom moving full time to Charlotte, we're still looking at more like 7-1. So even on that front, there are some other parts to that, that have led in that direction. But moving forward, I'm going to group 3 of these stats together because I think they tell a similar story, and then we'll move into probably the ones that may really give the better picture of what the difference is and where that 15 number is and where the 5 number is. But for qualified leads, and look, I want to confirm this. We are only talking about in-person appointments for this. So we kind of attempted to figure out how to do this. Brian and I are probably not the people to run these reports. We may have to get some help to get the full picture in terms of Asheville and Charlotte. My guess is we're probably looking at about double these, something like that roughly is where our numbers line up kind of firm wide. But for qualified leads for in-office appointment, we had 7 in Charlotte, we had 8 in Asheville. For leads, generally, we had 7 in Charlotte, 8 in Asheville. And then the last one for appointment set, we had 8 in Charlotte and 10 in Asheville. Some differences there, but overall, whole lot of similarities. I think week to week, if we looked at similar numbers, you could see those change, flip. I think we're all in the standard deviation there between where statistically we could be between these 2 offices, at least for that 1 week sample.
Yeah, that's some pretty fascinating numbers, because it does sound a lot alike. I want to see if I can share the screen real quickly of what and Frank, I assume you can see the funnel and the donut.
Mm-hmm.
This is a dashboard. This is what we play with all the time. You can actually see on here the funnel format of the way any sales team would look at the sales process. This is reflective of Charlotte, and here is our lead sources to give you sort of an idea about what we look at. And it's just fascinating for me to be able to deep dive into this. We can set up any parameters that we want. So, and that, like I said, that's in real time as that information is being entered in by our intake team, which is 7 people, really extra people than that, putting data together for us. I still don't think that we're quite the people in this as well as other people in the firm. We tend to be in the analysis part of the process, but I just wanted to show everybody how uh, it, the kind of data you need to be able to make this kind of decision making that we see. But yes, that means that we're attracting a similar amount of people to both of the firms. But I think if you deep dive into the next stage on that to get sort of where I think is the real issue. I don't know if
if you don't mind, pull that back up. Let's look at Charlotte and we can talk about these two.
Yeah.
So we're, like, as Brian alluded to, they are one of the probably the most glaring things. And again, it's a weak sample size. I mean, and there are some reasons that explain this, but where we see the biggest difference, and I'm going to tell you the numbers for Asheville, but like if you look here on this chart, there's a green area and it's the number of appointments that, I mean, the number of people that show for those appointments that they have scheduled. There can be some factors that lead into that. A lot of the times in-office appointments may be coming in. We do, like we've mentioned before, we do have a small consultation fee. If they're coming into the office, sometimes on a phone appointment, they're almost always going to pay beforehand, before that appointment is set. So most of the time they're going to show up. That's not always the case on in-office appointments, but that'll show you kind of some of the reasons for that gap. But when it comes to Charlotte, you have 8 appointments set. You only have 5 of those show. Okay, so 3 people out of 8. 8 not a huge number, but then we have 3 of those that we've already lost from that time where they called into the firm, said they needed to speak to a lawyer. They have a legal issue that we've identified as one that we can help them with, and they didn't come to that appointment. In Asheville, in that same period, we had 10 appointments set and 9 showed. So only 1 person in that same, and we may have messed our dates up, but yeah, there you go. So 10 appointments.
It takes a second to calculate back, but yeah.
So here's Asheville. The green number of people who showed out of those 10 in Asheville, 9 showed. And then, again, the most important number, but it's how do we get to that number? But the most important number, how many clients did we get out of those appointments? In Asheville, out of 10 appointments, we got 5 clients, which is a fantastic number for us. We will take 50% in every single office that we have, every single week, including some of our top offices. But in Charlotte, we had 5 show and we had 1 client that we got out of that. So a 20% rate. Again, that's a small sample size, but we only had 1 of those. When you look at those, when we start back at the appointment set, there were 8 appointments set. Only 1 of those turned into an actual client. In terms of Charlotte, that's a whole lot of time that goes into that, to those 8 people calling in and scheduling those appointments and us meeting with them and having the consult and doing those things. And it's disappointing when we get numbers like this week over week. It doesn't mean that, there won't be 3 of these people that met with us last week that come in tomorrow and retain, or that may have already, well, I guess no, it would show up on here if they had already retained, but, these people may be coming in later, but this is a disappointing number. And I think it really shows some of the major differences between where we are in Asheville right now and where we are in Charlotte.
I'm back over here to Charlotte now, and I want to bump out over here because I think, what we do is we indicate lead sources, and I wanted to stop share because I don't necessarily want to name names particularly on this, but sometimes you can get a sense about what's the chance that a potential client is going to become a client based on the referral source. What I mean by that is our number 1 retain rate of somebody to get that percentage up is if they were a prior client. If they were a prior client, the chances of them retaining again is in the high 80s. They know what's going on. They're not going to be sticker shocked. They're not going to be, well, I don't know if I can get along with them. They know what's happened. Our second one is attorney referrals. That if an attorney sends a person to us, chances are that attorney has prepped them and gotten them ready for what to expect, and that's, I mean, nothing is better. I mean, think about it in your own life. If you have a medical issue and then somebody else says, well, why don't you talk to my doctor? And that doctor says, oh, you need to go see this doctor. That the chances of you using that doctor is probably that kind of high percentage. And then it's personal referrals. One of the lowest is when we're a member of certain services, okay, and a lot of people out there have legal protection type services. There's a lot of them out there, and usually that comes with some kind of benefit. They pay something to a company, and that gives them some kind of benefit when they come to our office. Maybe the company's going to pay, or they're going to pay a percentage or something like that. That person has a very low level of pre-trust in our firm. They have no idea what it's going to cost. Oftentimes, they feel like that it should be free. They're paying for a legal service. So when they need a lawyer, that should be free. Much like the way insurance works. I'm like, I have health insurance. I should be able to go to a doctor. And then suddenly you realize you have a high deductible and you have to do all this payment. And, it doesn't seem like a deal as much, or at least, in your mind, you kind of thought this was something covered. So the chances of retaining that person is pretty low. And I think that is how some of our Charlotte appointments come in, because we don't have a lot of firms right now sending us clients. We're still new there, and they may not know that we're there. Now, it did happen, and that is how you got your client there in Charlotte. But, I think that is something that's going to affect it, because, like I said, essentially Asheville and Charlotte last week did the same amount of work. They both, we both had the intake team putting 10 appointments together. Doesn't matter if it's good or bad. That's about the same amount of work. And meeting with people, it takes just as long. So that's why it's so important that you get as large of an outcome as possible out of that work that was done.
Yeah, and off of that point, half of our appointments last week in Charlotte came from some level of, legal insurance, whatever whatever you want to call these groups. I know that's probably not the proper name, but these companies that do this type of thing, specifically, it's more, it can be offered by employers, things like that. A lot of times there are some benefits to that, meaning it's the type of clients that we want in a lot of situations. I don't know that we've been seeing that effect so far in Charlotte, but when you have this service that offers, hey, we have this agreement and you're guaranteed this free appointment, it can be more of a, it's much easier to pick up the phone and make that call knowing you have no risk and you don't have to pay anything and all those parts than it is to, actually take the time to look up, hey, who is an attorney in this area? How much is this going to cost? I have to pay this $50. I have to go to the office, do these steps. And I'm guessing that's a big reason for why we saw such a low show number in Charlotte too, at least related to that. We did have some other, some of the other similar parts. There were a similar number of lead sources that were internet based, which is, a decent size of the rest of them too. But one of the big things I think that really illustrates is how many kind of these word of mouth type appointments that we're really getting in Asheville. And, on that same line, it highlights, it zooms in on what issues we see office wide, firm wide in terms of appointments. Because we see these things like, the correlation between what type of appointment you get and how likely they are to retain. And it puts an emphasis on it for sure. And I think it shows that, even though it may not be the way that we grow Rutherford, or our Forest City office, may be completely different from the way that we would grow Charlotte, because we could go to court. We're in court all the time. Every day there's a court day in Rutherford County. Every day there's a court day in McDowell County. One of our attorneys is in court. It happens every single day. Like, this FaceTime is there. We know all the attorneys. Start to say judges. We do know them, but not to go down that line. It's not like some kind of ethical issue, whatever. But we have those relationships with everybody in these counties. In Mecklenburg, we have none of those connections. In Buncombe, we have some of those connections. And I think that really, you don't do a lot of that in terms of marketing. We don't put a lot of focus on that anymore on that front, but it's a real thing. It's a real thing that does matter, especially when you look at week over week, because we get one former client, or we get one, that was another attorney referral, or we get one that is a direct word of mouth type, and those are more difficult for us to track too. But if your mom, your girlfriend, somebody close to you says, I used King Law and they were great, you're gonna go to that firm. I mean, and you're not gonna question everything as much. So creating those type of relationships, I think, is important. I know it's important, but it's just figuring out how we can do more of it, in Mecklenburg.
It also, this deep dive that we're doing, as we start wrapping this thing up a little bit, it goes back to our 10X book that got it started. And I remember how in the book, there's a lot of discussion about being brought into a company and doing the analysis and looking at it. And that oftentimes the company owners want to say, well, what does our sales team need to be selling? What do they need to be saying to make that person come? And he would say things like, well, your product sucks. Like, it's not, there's no magic words that it's your people need to be saying. And I think that that's one of the problems, that it would be very easy for us to sit there and look at the numbers and be like, well, clearly we need to get better salespeople in Charlotte. But when you dig into it, you realize, like, no, that there's a different fundamental client base. Blake, for instance, in Charlotte, who's looking at this from a personal injury standpoint, he doesn't want to take every client on. I mean, everybody who thinks that they got injured in an accident does not necessarily mean that that's going to be a good case for us. And that's a contingency fee case. So that's something that a law firm eats all of the cost on for hopes of a reward somewhere down the road that the client, that the client's going to get and that we get to share in. So, you want to be very careful when you're looking at numbers, that you can dig as deep as you can, and then you realize, like, wait a second, what we really need is not necessarily more volume. We can make money out of the volume that we're getting. We need to increase the quality of that. And, it might take more volume to get quality. I mean, in theory, somebody who, if you're looking for gold, if you have 10 mines, you're probably more likely to strike gold than if you hit one. But it still doesn't mean you should just build a mine everywhere. You got to really analyze and determine what that is. And there is probably some of this is a sales part of it that you want to constantly work on and be able to build that confidence on. But as a business owner, we don't have the luxury of being able to berate employees, team members, based on what those numbers are. What we need to do is be able to understand it, get to the drawing board and say, like, okay, what do we need to do? How do we get these referral sources? How do we get these prior clients coming back to our firm instead of going somewhere else? That's where you want to spend your time and effort, understanding what that potential client is. how much work do we want to do on people that aren't going to show? And we know that they're not going to show when that phone call is finished. What can we do to work the right minds? And I think that that's what we're doing. And it's exciting. It's fun. Regardless, between Nashville and Charlotte, I'd say that we held our own. If you added those two things up, I'd still say that, hey, arrow up, business is going the right direction. They're more than paying their bills. This is what we want to do. We're putting these pieces in the right places to be able to do that, because we would definitely like that those lead sources to double in that amount of time. We'd love to have 20 a week coming in as opposed to 10. But if you did that, then we'd be talking about really blowing our numbers away. And I think that's where we are.
Yeah, I'm gonna take your 10x example and take it a step further too, because and I think it's still a positive of the book, but it kind of could push back on this some too. So basically, and I think this is Grant Cardone's philosophy. If I can get one client doing something, if I put 10 times the work into that, then I could get 10 clients doing it the same way. If you look at that analogy for Charlotte, we could put 10 times what we're doing there into these areas that we're already in, meaning how many different, legal insurance providers are there out there? How many different are these things that we could do and stack up? And maybe that means we'd have, 80 consults set and 40 of them show, and maybe we'd get 10 clients out of that, or whatever the number is, or 5 clients or whatever it is. But I think we need to 10x this thing. I think that there's time that needs to be put into it, but I think we need to be smart about where we're putting it, because I think that's the key, is not how do we take what we're doing and just scale that up. I don't think that's the question. I think it's really, where do we need to be putting this time and energy and resources in to get the right leads coming in. And firm wide, we can look at leads and say, you know what, they're pretty much all the same. Every month we get the same, we get the same number of retains off a number of leads. And we can say, hey, there's the funnel. If we can get this top part, we're going to get the rest. But if these numbers stack up week over week, that could be, the simplest explanation for some of the differences that we have in Charlotte and that we have had in Charlotte. So, I think there are parts to that we'll see how much there is correlation over time. But ultimately, I think that's where the focus is, for sure. And it makes it a little bit easier on that front too. And if it's not the lead source, then what else might be wrong? We got to take variables out. Maybe it is a sales problem then, or maybe it is maybe our fees are not competitive, or whatever it is. I don't think that's the case at all in Charlotte market, but just whatever those things might be. So I think we just have to eliminate variables. And if we do that, one of the biggest ones is going to be the lead sources. So how do we change that and make it look more like what we're seeing in some of our better offices? And it really would be interesting to see how that stacks up for Asheville too. But I know it's 2 weeks in a row. We've got a lot of numbers, and I think I'm ready to wrap up here on this week. And I think next week we really should talk more. What are we looking for in the people, in terms of interview process, in terms of candidates, in terms of, who fits the King Law mold, and who are we looking to grow with long term. Did a TikTok on it this morning. It's got me thinking about that issue. So maybe we can adjust, but just kind of one idea that I think might make sense too.
Yeah, it really is, because what really gets the fun into it is you start to see these numbers start to come in, and you start building like, okay, now what is that? How do I take that, raw data, frontline kind of numbers, and be like, okay, well, how big of a team do we need to be putting to this? Is more people, more, more specialists? What do we need to be able to kind of make that work? And that becomes really exciting. I hope you guys are enjoying this. If you've made it all the way to this point, my guess is you have a keen interest in what numbers are and what building actually looks like. And I hope this really peels back the curtain to show you on how that is. So thanks. And I guess we will see you guys next week.
Yeah. And one last thing, just to update. Now we've been sharing this a little more. So it's not real time. So you're a little bit behind us, or we're a little bit ahead of you, I guess I should say. But we've gotten some pretty good feedback on it so far, I think, in terms of number of views and
been
all those
fantastic. I would have never guessed over 1,000 views, and not just for the first one in curiosity, but following up. So I would love to see that number go, and of course we want as much feedback as possible.
Yeah, so if you're listening, hey, give us some questions, give us what you'd like to hear more of too.
All right, sounds good.